England sent 115 people to build a colony in 1587. When someone finally came back to check on them 3 years later, every single one had vanished. No bodies, no graves, no signs of fighting. Just a single word and 3 letters carved into wood, and silence where a settlement used to stand. The colony on Roanoke Island is usually told as a ghost story. The mysterious disappearance, the eerie carving, the unanswered question hanging over 4 centuries of American history. And if you stopped there, it would be a great campfire tale. The problem is that stopping there gets the story almost entirely wrong. Because those 115 people probably did not vanish. We have a decent idea of what happened to most of them. We just spent a very long time not wanting to look. To understand Roanoke, you need to back up about 3 years before the famous colony even arrived, and you need to understand that England in the 1580s was a country that wanted an empire but had almost no idea how to build one. Spain was already hauling gold and silver out of the Americas by the shipload. England was jealous, broke, and looking for a foothold. In 1584, Queen Elizabeth granted a man named Walter Raleigh a patent to explore and colonize any lands in the New World not already claimed by a Christian prince. The phrasing itself tells you how they thought about this. If another Christian kingdom had not planted a flag, it was fair game. Indigenous people living there for thousands of years did not factor into the equation. Raleigh sent scouting expeditions to the coast of what is now North Carolina. His men explored the barrier islands and shallow sounds, and they came back with a name for this territory: Virginia, after Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. They also came back with a recommendation. Roanoke Island, tucked between the Outer Banks and the mainland, looked like a reasonable spot for a base. It was close enough to Spanish shipping lanes to serve as a launching point for privateers, which was half the reason England wanted a colony here anyway. The grand plan was part military outpost, part agricultural settlement, part base for raiding Spanish treasure ships. On paper, it sounded workable. In practice, it was underfunded, logistically fragile, and built on an almost total ignorance of the land and the people already living on it. Roanoke Island sat within the territory of Algonquian-speaking peoples, including the Roanoke and Croatoan groups. These were not small wandering bands. They had agriculture, fishing systems, regional trade networks, and political structures that had been functioning long before any English ship appeared on the horizon. The Croatoan people lived on a nearby island the English called Croatoan, which today is called Hatteras Island. Early interactions between the English and these communities swung between cautious hospitality and real tension, especially once food became an issue, and food became an issue almost immediately. The first actual English settlement on Roanoke arrived in 1585. This was not the famous Lost Colony. This was an earlier attempt, a military garrison under Governor Ralph Lane, backed by Raleigh and supplied by a fleet under Sir Richard Grenville. Roughly 600 men sailed out, but only about 100 stayed on the island over the winter, building a fort and a handful of houses. They ran into trouble fast. The sounds were too shallow for large ships to navigate safely. The fort they built, Fort Raleigh, was a modest thing. Small houses, earthwork defences, the minimum a group of soldiers could throw together while also trying to figure out how to eat. Because food was the real problem. England had sent these men across the ocean, with supplies meant to last until the next resupply ship arrived, and the next resupply ship was on Raleigh's schedule, not theirs. When the food started running low, Lane turned to the people who actually knew how to live on this land. The Algonquian communities around Roanoke had been farming and fishing here for generations. They had corn, they had established fishing systems, and they had their own food pressures to manage. Lane's approach to food diplomacy was about what you would expect from a military man running out of patience. When trade did not produce enough, he took. His men raided indigenous villages, they burned crops, they killed a local leader named Wingina who had initially been one of their hosts. This was not a calculated strategic move. It was a hungry, frightened garrison lashing out at the people they depended on, destroying the one relationship that might have saved them. Whatever trust had existed between the two sides died with Wingina. The message to every indigenous community within 100 miles was simple. The English take what they want and they will kill you if you resist. This is going to echo forward in ways that nobody on Roanoke Island appreciated at the time. By 1586, after a severe winter and supply shortfalls that nobody in London seemed to care about, most of Lane's men gave up. When Sir Francis Drake happened to stop by with his fleet, they jumped aboard and sailed home. a tiny detachment of soldiers was left behind to hold the fort. When the next group of colonists arrived the following year, in 1587, they found one sun-bleached skeleton and nothing else. That tiny garrison was gone. Nobody recorded what happened to them. This is already a pattern. England sends people across the ocean, fails to support them, and then acts surprised when things go badly. Now, the 1587 colony. This is the group everyone talks about. Raleigh had learned at least one lesson from Lane's failure. An all-male military garrison was not going to build a lasting colony, so this time he authorised a mixed settlement. Men, women, children, families, craftsmen and farmers, about 115 people in total, though the exact number varies slightly depending on the source. Their governor was John White, an artist and surveyor who had been on the earlier expeditions and knew the area. He was not a soldier. He was a map maker who could paint watercolours of the local plants and animals. This was, in some ways, a vote of confidence from Raleigh that this colony would be different, more permanent, more civilised. The word they used for it was the City of Raleigh. The colony was not even supposed to end up on Roanoke. White and his settlers were heading for the Chesapeake Bay, further north, where the land was more fertile, the harbours were deeper, and the defensive position was better. That was where the City of Raleigh was supposed to stand. The pilot of their ship, a man named Simon Fernandez, refused to take them there. He said the season was too far gone, that they could not risk the additional sailing time. He simply put them ashore at Roanoke in July 1587, and that was that. Whether Fernandez had his own reasons, whether he was more interested in getting back to privateering, whether he was genuinely worried about the calendar, or whether he simply did not care enough about 100 civilians to argue the point is something historians still debate. The result was the same. These families, including pregnant women, were dropped on an island where the previous English garrison had burned every relationship with the local population in a fort that was falling apart, with barely 3 months before winter. They repaired what they could. The fort was in ruins. The small houses that Lane's men had built were overgrown and rotting. They patched walls and cleared brush and tried to turn a military camp into something resembling a home for families with children. They tried to re-establish contact with the nearby Indigenous groups. The damage from Lane's violence made that extremely difficult. When English messengers approached some of the mainland communities, they were met with silence or hostility. The memory of Wingina's death had not faded. You do not burn a community's crops and murder their leader, and then expect a warm welcome 13 months later just because you brought women this time. One of the very first things that happened after arrival was that a colonist named George Howe was killed while crabbing alone in the shallows. He was wading in the water, alone and unarmed, when he was attacked. The settlement was barely a week old and already they had lost someone. The fear that must have produced in a group of 115 people, many of them families, sleeping behind a half-repaired palisade on an island where they were not wanted is hard to overstate. And yet the Croatoan people, over on Hatteras Island, remained on relatively better terms. Manteo, a Croatoan man who had actually travelled to England and back with the earlier expeditions, served as a go-between. That distinction between the Croatoan and some of the mainland groups is going to matter a great deal later. In August 1587, Virginia Dare was born, the governor's granddaughter, the daughter of Eleanor Dare, who was John White's own child. Virginia Dare is often described as the first English child born in the Americas. She became almost immediately a symbol, a tiny proof that England could reproduce itself on the other side of the Atlantic. She was days old when the colony made its most fateful decision. The settlers did not have enough supplies, not even close. They had arrived too late to plant a full growing season. The food they brought from England was dwindling, and the local food networks that might have supplemented their stores were largely closed to them because of Lane's legacy. They knew a single winter without resupply could finish them. The math was simple and terrible. 115 mouths, not enough food, no ships on the horizon, and an island where half the neighbouring communities wanted nothing to do with them. Collectively, they asked John White to sail back to England and bring help. This was an agonising choice for White. The colonists did not want to lose their governor. White did not want to leave. He was being asked to abandon his daughter Eleanor, his newborn grandchild Virginia, and over 100 people who depended on him, to cross the Atlantic in autumn when the weather was turning, and to come back with food, tools and reinforcements before things collapsed. There was no guarantee he could get a ship quickly. There was no guarantee the colony would survive the winter. There was no guarantee he would ever see any of them again. He agreed because there was no better option. He left. He expected to be gone a few months at most. He was gone 3 years. White sailed back to England and walked into a geopolitical disaster. The Anglo-Spanish War was heating up. In 1588, the Spanish Armada sailed for England. Every available ship was pressed into military service. Private vessels that might have carried supplies to a tiny colonial outpost in North Carolina were suddenly needed to defend the English Channel. White begged, lobbied, and wrote letters to anyone who might help. Nobody could spare a ship. The colony on Roanoke was not a military priority. It was not even a financial priority. It was 115 people on a sandbar, and the entire weight of European war was sitting on the other side of the scale. White did not manage to get back until August 1590, and even then it was only because he secured passage on a privateering expedition that agreed to swing by Roanoke as a side trip. 3 years. Think about what 3 years of silence means when you are depending on a resupply ship to survive. When White's party reached the island, they found the settlement empty. The houses had been taken down, the fortifications were dismantled. Personal belongings, the heavy tools and bulky household items you would expect if people had been living here for years were gone. No bodies, no signs of a fight, no burial mounds, no scorched earth. Whatever happened to the colony on Roanoke Island, it was not a sudden catastrophe that caught them sleeping. They had packed up and left, and they had done it with enough time and composure to take their things with them. That is the behaviour of people making a plan, not people running for their lives in the middle of the night. There were 2 clues. On a post near the fort, someone had carved the word Croatoan. On a nearby tree, the letters Crow. Before White had sailed for England, he and the colonists had agreed on a system. If they moved, they would carve the name of their destination. If they moved under duress, under threat or attack, they would carve a Maltese cross or some other distress symbol. There was no cross, no distress marker, just a destination, Croatoan. White understood exactly what this meant. The colonists had gone to Croatoan Island, to the Hatteras people, who had been their closest indigenous allies. He wanted to sail there immediately. Storms prevented it. His ships were damaged, the weather was worsening, and the privateering captains had no interest in risking their vessels for a side quest they did not care about. White was forced to give up. He sailed back to England. He never saw his daughter or granddaughter again. He never found out what happened to any of them. And for about 400 years, neither did anyone else, at least not in any way that satisfied the popular imagination. The story of the Lost Colony became a mystery, a riddle wrapped in fog, the kind of story that invites wild speculation precisely because the official record goes quiet at the worst possible moment. Except the record does not actually go quiet. We just have to be willing to read it differently. Start with the environment. Tree ring data from the region tell us something that changes the whole calculus of this story. The Roanoke colony was founded and abandoned during the worst drought in at least 800 years across that part of North Carolina and Virginia. Not a bad year, not a dry spell. The worst sustained drought since roughly 800 AD. The drought ran from roughly 1587 to 1589, covering almost exactly the period when those 115 people were alone on Roanoke with no resupply coming. Climate historians who studied the cypress tree rings across the region found that rainfall dropped to levels that would have devastated corn production, dried up freshwater sources, and reduced the fish runs in the shallow sounds. An 800-year drought. That is not bad luck. That is a civilization-level stress event hitting a group with almost no reserves, no deep knowledge of the land, and no backup plan. The drought did not just affect the English. It crushed indigenous agriculture too. The tribes that the colonists might have traded with or begged food from were themselves fighting for survival. Every ear of corn, every fish, every stored provision became more valuable and more contested. Sharing food with a group of foreigners who had already attacked your neighbours becomes a harder sell when your own children are hungry. The environmental conditions alone explain most of the decisions that followed. Now look at what archaeologists have found in the last few decades. On Hatteras Island, the old Croatoan homeland, teams led by Mark Horton from the University of Bristol and local researcher Scott Dawson have dug up a mix of Indigenous and 16th century English material that is hard to explain any other way. Broken English bowls, a sword hilt, a fragment of a slate writing tablet, metal tools that had been repurposed, a Tudor rose badge, a Nuremberg token from the 1500s. All of this was found inside indigenous village sites mixed in with native material. These were not trade goods passed along from a distant contact. They were the everyday objects of English domestic life, sitting in the ground where Croatoan people lived. And then there is the hammer scale, large quantities of it. Hammer scale is the tiny flakes of iron that fly off when a blacksmith works hot metal. The Croatoan people did not traditionally work iron. They had no forges, no anvils, no experience shaping metal this way. But someone was running a forge in their village, someone who knew how to do English-style blacksmithing, operating for what appears to be years, if not decades. That does not come from a brief visit or a single trade exchange. That comes from English metal workers living with the Croatoan, settled in, doing their trade as part of the community. Houghton and Dawson have said publicly that they consider the evidence to be overwhelming. Their phrase is mountains of evidence. In their view, the Roanoke colonists moved to Croatoan Island, just as the carving said they would, and they were absorbed into the Hatteras community. They lived, they worked, they intermarried, they stopped being a separate English colony and became part of a native community. The so-called mystery, in their reading, was manufactured by later generations who preferred a ghost story to the more complicated truth. That is one strand of the answer. There is another. John White, the governor and painter, left behind a map, La Virginia Pars. It is a beautiful piece of work, hand-drawn and coloured, showing the coastline of North Carolina with its barrier islands, sounds and rivers. It ended up in the British Museum. For centuries it was treated as a beautiful but straightforward piece of 16th century cartography, admired for its artistry, catalogued and more or less left alone. Then someone noticed that two small areas on the map had been covered with patches, not damage, deliberate patches, corrections or additions that had been glued over the original drawing, hiding something underneath. This is the kind of detail that sends historians into a very specific kind of frenzy. Modern imaging technology, using transmitted light and spectral analysis, peeled those patches back without physically touching them. Beneath one of them was the outline of a small fort symbol, drawn in the same style as the rest of the map. It was located about 50 miles inland from Roanoke, along the Albemarle Sound. White himself had noted in other writings that the colonists intended to move 50 miles into the mainland interior. The hidden fort on his own map matched the distance he described. That hidden fort guided the first colony foundation to start digging at inland locations referred to as Site X and Site Y, in present-day Bertie County, North Carolina. What they found was English pottery, borderware and other ceramics dating to the late 1500s, the exact period of the Roanoke colony. These ceramics were mixed into indigenous village context, just like the Hatteras finds, and there is no record of any other English settlement in that interior area during the 16th century. None. The most logical source for those objects is Roanoke colonists, who left the island and moved inland. So now you have two separate archaeological trails leading away from Roanoke. One goes southeast to Croatoan Island, the other goes roughly 50 miles inland to the Albemarle Sound region. Both show English material from the right time period, both show up in native village sites, and both are consistent with people who packed their belongings and walked. The colonists probably split up, and when you think about it, splitting up was the rational move. A group of 115 people descending on a single community during the worst drought in 800 years would have been a burden that even the friendliest hosts could not absorb. Smaller groups scattering to different communities, spreading the demand for food across a wider network, would have had a better chance. Some went southeast to the Croatoan, who had been their steadiest allies and who lived on an island where fishing could supplement failing crops. Others went inland, perhaps following trade routes that Manteo or other indigenous contacts had described, aiming for the site marked on White's map where the hidden fort symbol sits, 50 miles from the coast along the Albemarle Sound. This is not the clean narrative that anyone wants. People want a single answer. They were massacred, they starved, they were rescued, they walked into the woods and vanished. The archaeological picture is messier and more human than any of those options. Some of them likely went to the Croatoan, where they had allies and where the carved message pointed. Others appear to have headed inland, following trade routes or seeking better agricultural land. In both cases, they were absorbed into indigenous communities over time, through intermarriage, adoption, and the simple mathematics of small groups blending into larger ones. That does not mean everyone survived. The drought would have killed some before they ever left Roanoke. Disease, malnutrition, and the sheer physical toll of displacement would have claimed others during or after the move, and there are scattered hints that some colonists met violent ends. Decades later, when the Jamestown colony was established in 1607, the English were specifically told to ask about the Roanoke survivors. Jamestown colonists heard rumours and reports that some Europeans were living among various tribes, sometimes as adoptees, sometimes in conditions closer to slavery. Some were said to be working metal or beating copper, skills that point straight back to the Roanoke settlers. There was also a darker thread. Powhatan, the powerful leader of the Confederacy that dominated the Chesapeake Bay area, reportedly told the Jamestown English that his forces had destroyed a group of foreigners living with the Chesapeakean people, a tribe on the southern shores of the bay. Some later writers connected this claim to Roanoke survivors who might have reached the Chesapeake, which was, after all, where the colony had originally been headed before Fernandez dumped them at Roanoke. William Strachey, a secretary at Jamestown, recorded accounts of Europeans seen among certain tribes, possibly living as slaves or captives, beating copper and practicing other European skills. This connection between the Chesapeakean massacre and Roanoke is uncertain. The accounts are second-hand at best, filtered through layers of translation and political manoeuvring. Powhatan had reasons to intimidate the Jamestown settlers, and claiming to have wiped out the previous English attempt would have served that purpose neatly. It was a warning wrapped in a history lesson. You are not the first English here, and look what happened to the last ones. Historians take the claim seriously but treat it with appropriate suspicion. It might describe the fate of one splinter group. It does not explain everyone. What all of these fragments suggest, taken together, is not a single event but a slow unravelling. A colony that held on as long as it could, that made a deliberate decision to leave, and that broke into pieces as different families and groups found different routes to survival. Some found it, some did not, so you can sketch a rough picture. The colony, starving and cut off during the worst drought in 8 centuries, made a rational decision to leave Roanoke. They did not panic. They dismantled their homes, packed what they could carry, and carved their destination on a post for the governor they hoped would come back for them. Some went to Croatoan and lived with the Hatteras people, leaving behind forges and pottery and tokens and writing tablets scattered through the soil of a village that welcomed them. Some went inland, carrying their English ceramics into villages along the Albemarle Sound, following a plan that White himself had sketched on his map and then covered with a patch. Some may have pushed further, toward the Chesapeake, where they fell victim to political violence between native polities jockeying for control over territory and resources. Over years and decades, the survivors blended into Indigenous societies through marriage and cultural absorption, until no recognisable English colony existed anymore. By the time Jamestown was founded 20 years later, whatever remained of the Roanoke settlers existed as scattered individuals within native communities, and as fragments of oral tradition that the Jamestown English only half understood and less than half believed. That leaves the theories that do not hold up as well. The Spanish attack hypothesis sounds plausible on its face. Spain had every reason to wipe out an English base near their shipping lanes, but no Spanish document records such an operation, and the archaeology on Roanoke does not show a destruction layer consistent with a military attack. No burned fort, no signs of bombardment. The theory works on paper, but has nothing underneath it. A similar problem haunts the idea that the colonists tried to sail home. They had small boats. The Outer Banks are famous for their storms and shoals. A group of desperate people attempting to cross the Atlantic in a craft built for coastal waters would have been swallowed almost immediately. No wreck tied to Roanoke colonists has ever been identified. It is possible, but it fails to account for the archaeological evidence of people walking away from the island with their belongings and settling elsewhere. Then there are the truly bad theories: cannibalism, supernatural explanations. The word Croatoan picked up a strange second life in American pop mythology, completely detached from its actual meaning as a place name. Edgar Allan Poe supposedly muttered it before he died, a claim that has the distinct flavour of something invented decades after the fact to make a literary death more interesting. The word showed up in horror fiction, paranormal television, and internet creepypasta. At some point, it stopped meaning a real island where real people lived and became a kind of all-purpose symbol for mysterious disappearance. None of that has any connection to 16th century reality. Croatoan was a village. It was on Hatteras Island. People lived there, and English people almost certainly lived there too for years, if not decades. Turning a real community into a ghost story catchphrase is its own kind of erasure. The most famous fraudulent artifact is probably the Dare stones. Starting in the late 1930s, inscribed stones began turning up across the southeastern United States, supposedly carved by Eleanor Dare as she wandered through the wilderness recording the colony's fate. The first stone was found in a swamp in North Carolina. Others followed, from Georgia, from South Carolina, tracing an increasingly elaborate journey that read less like a desperate survival account and more like someone working from a map with too much imagination. The stones describe deaths, Indian attacks, the loss of Virginia Dare, and desperate wandering. People wanted them to be real. For a brief period, respected institutions took them seriously. The vice president of Roanoke College even offered a reward for more stones, which predictably led to more stones appearing. Scholars now consider the entire series to be forgeries, products of a Depression-era fascination with Roanoke that coincided with the opening of Paul Green's outdoor drama The Lost Colony in 1937. The stones told a story people wanted to hear, which is usually a reliable sign that the story is being made up. Scott Dawson, the Hatteras Island researcher who has spent years working the Croatoan dig sites, has pointed out something uncomfortable about the whole lost colony industry. Calling it a mystery serves the tourist trade, it serves the outdoor drama, it serves the gift shops and the annual festivals. What it does not serve is the Croatoan people, whose ancestors took in the English, fed them, lived with them, and were then erased from the story so that the disappearance could remain spooky. The myth of the vanishing colony requires the indigenous communities to be invisible. Once you see them, the mystery starts to dissolve. None of this means every question is answered. We do not have a name-by-name accounting of who went where. We cannot say with certainty how many survived the first winter after leaving Roanoke, or how long the integrated communities lasted. The inland sites at Bertie County have produced modest finds so far, and more excavation is needed. The Hatteras material is stronger, but even there, no one has found a gravestone with an English name or a journal buried in the sand. We are working with broken bowls and forged residue, and a single word carved into a post. It is incomplete. But incomplete is not the same as unknowable. Incomplete is normal. This is what a 440-year-old story looks like when the people living it did not know they were going to become a mystery. They just left a message and walked to where they thought they could survive. John White died in Ireland sometime around 1593. He never returned to the Americas. His last known writing about Roanoke expresses his hope that the colonists were safe among their friends on Croatoan. The carving said Croatoan. The archaeology now backs that up. White was probably right all along. We just took 4 centuries to believe him. Virginia Dare, his granddaughter, born in August 1587, disappears from the English record entirely after White sailed away. Whether she lived to adulthood on Hatteras Island, married into the Croatoan community, died young of disease or hunger, or made it inland along the Albemarle Sound, no surviving document tells us, she became a symbol long before anyone bothered to look for the actual person. The colony was never really lost. It was abandoned by the country that sent it, left to survive or die during the worst environmental conditions in nearly a millennium, and then mythologized into a ghost story because the truth was harder to sell. 115 people carved the name of their destination and walked toward the people most likely to keep them alive. The forge on Hatteras Island, with its hammer scale scattered through the soil, is still there. Somebody worked that iron for years.